without further ado, I am going to introduce our keynote speaker. You're in for a treat throughout the next 2 days, and especially with our keynote. Cemeré James recently joined the Children's Defense Fund as Interim National Director of Movement Building, where she leads CDF's work to build power for children and educate our communities on racial justice. Prior to joining CDF, Cemeré served as interim president and CEO at the National Black Child Development Institute. At NBCDI, she honed her ability to lead with a mix of composure and inspiration through trying times of unexpected leadership change within the organization, a global pandemic, and racial reckoning. As VP and SVP for policy at NBCDI, she increased funding for the policy department by 7-fold in 4 years. That's pretty impressive. She developed her leadership style through thoughtful community and stakeholder engagement, data and research-driven decision-making, seeking out thought leaders with a historical perspective, and taking a cross-disciplinary approach. That's what we're all about. After earning her MPP at University of Chicago, Cemeré James's life as an advocate began when she joined the inaugural cohort of Illinois Early Childhood Fellows, currently known as the Barbara Bowman Leadership Fellows. We are delighted to hear from Cemeré this morning as she delivers our keynote, Equity in Early Childhood, an Ongoing Process for Systems-Level Leaders. Cemeré, thank you.
So good morning. I am honored, Dr. Kelly, by that introduction. And I have to say to Jamie that I actually do remember school. Like, this feels very much like school, and I loved school, so I feel at home. So to Jamie, to Megan, to Mary, thank you so much for inviting me. I really am honored to be here, and I'm honored to spend the next hour with all of you. So I want to talk through. I'll present on briefly. Do I have that? Oh, perfect. So because my mom and my dad are here, I made sure to put the phonetic spelling of my name, just to make sure that I honor them. But today we're going to talk through some equity principles that I have. I want to talk about kind of the internal work that we have to do around advocating for systems change, advocating for equity, and I'll leave plenty of time for Q&A because, like I said, I want us to be conversational with each other. So just to start, I'm giving what I've developed as my definition of equity and systems work, just given the years that I've worked on this. And my point that I want to highlight here is meeting children's needs requires partnering with and supporting the experts, the families and providers that educate and nurture children every day. These experts must be engaged to define quality and assess whether all children's needs are being met. So some grounding. I start with this quote from Einstein because I want us to have an open mind as we talk about some tough topics today. My mind is already open because I know what I'm going to say, but I'm inviting you all, please do have an open mind as we're going into this conversation. The changes that we want to make for children aren't going to happen with the same thought patterns that we had when we created those changes. And so for me, I approach equity with principles because principles create the thinking that, that drive systems. And so in order to drive systems change, you need to be able to embrace some different principles. So I start with my guiding principle. It's going to sound a lot like what I have already said to you all, about ensuring that the people who are doing the work are the ones that inform policy change. So I've done policy work for many years. I don't consider myself a policy solutions person. I consider myself a policy interpreter, meaning that the solutions come from the people who do the work. They come from the families and communities that we serve. I'm just here to write it down in a way that policymakers can embrace. So my first principle is around the program standards. It's the policies that we all kind of live by, have to adhere to, give compliance to. At times, they don't align with equity. They don't align with what our families and children need. And I want to encourage us all to speak up against those, to have an opinion, to have something to say. Now, I don't want to sound naive that you speak up and things change. It takes years to get to the types of changes that we want for children, but I want to encourage us to continue to speak up. And I'll talk about resilience later, but definitely ensure that we're not thinking these things happen overnight, but we want to know what our approach is so we have some grounding for ourselves. My next principle is the importance of valuing equity, diversity, and quality at the same level. Reforms to advance systems must be implemented in a way that addresses, not exacerbates, inequities. Raising the quality of education, raising the quality of our health programs while making those programs more exclusionary, less accessible to diverse children, that doesn't advance our communities, that continues to pull us apart. And so to evaluate this, we need data. We need to know how we're impacting diverse populations. We need to know how we're engaging with families and providers. We need to know that the providers that are nurturing our children, the parents that are raising our children, are involved in the conversation about equity. And then lastly, diversity means both diverse lived experience and diverse thought. We want to ensure that we're engaging different voices, because the definition of equity is that all the voices are heard and all needs are met. So a couple of examples about what happens when we're not thinking about equity, diversity, and quality. Research indicates that communities with the highest percentages of Black families have a lower supply of childcare. So for us, that means that children have less access to early education. Studies also demonstrate that a diverse workforce is essential to child development, because educators of color typically hold higher expectations of children of color and are less likely to misdiagnose them with special needs. So again, diversity, equity, quality are all at an equal footing. So I want to double down on this idea that this work is hard, because equity, diversity, and quality, as we know, are expensive. These are things that cost money. And as we see, we are not at the high end in our country of spending here. So again, I just want to couch this with, this is tough, tough work. My final, and my equity principles before we start to talk about kind of how do you develop your own. I don't want to copy paste my principles, my thinking into your minds. I want us all to go on a journey that I started many years ago. So my last, inclusion, not exclusion. Children need to receive positive, affirming messages about their race, their identity, their gender, that are woven into program design, that are woven into curriculum and into pedagogy. So I want to share one story that I think kind of lifts up and makes really plain the image that I have for you of Maslow's hierarchy of need. This is the story of Sandra Taylor, a leader in the Atlanta community who is also the owner of several child care centers. Sandra's story. As an early childhood administrator, my teachers and I became frustrated as we found ourselves resorting to suspension and in some cases expulsion because we simply did not know other effective discipline strategies to address behaviors that disrupt learning and affect other children. Recognizing the negative impacts of exclusionary discipline, I began to look for alternative methods to address this issue. And I implemented a mental health program in my centers called CAMP, Childhood Acute Mental Health Practices. So they used the acronym of CAMP so that they weren't getting into that stigma of mental health and making parents uncomfortable. But children receive comprehensive services that are confidential, they're culturally responsive, including screenings, assessments, treatments. Additionally, our families are empowered through family counseling, while teachers receive training so that they knew how to improve their classroom practices to have more discipline, but also to ensure that they're identifying mental health challenges among their children. They established collaborative partnership with mental health providers and brought them into their centers. And then lastly, they had a feeder program where children that were receiving mental health supports in early childhood also received them when they got to elementary school. This to me is a perfect example of ensuring that a center is addressing every level of that hierarchy of need. True inclusion is when you determine that a child needs more resources and you look to the community to help to provide those resources instead of dismissing that child and that family. So I want to ask us, how many of you can think of like the 10 worst things you've done in your life? Most of us, we get to like 3 things and we don't even want to think about anymore, right? Like nobody wants to go through that. But people stood by us through those mistakes that we've made. And we want to ensure that children know that they're not going to be given up on at 4 and 5 years old over mistakes that they've made. So those are my top 3, top 4 principles around equity. I want to talk about, though, how we develop our own. Again, I'm not here to preach to you. I want to have a conversation. So I talk about this in 3 steps: equity literate, equity fluent, and equity effective. Literate being exactly kind of what the word means. It means having that baseline understanding, building your knowledge over time. For me, it took me some years to get through this process of literate, fluent, and then effective. But when I think about how I built it, I encourage people to think about how you learned how to read. It didn't happen overnight. You started with your basics of your ABCs, you built skills, you had literacy tools. And one of the things we do is we make reading fun. And so ensure that you're also making it fun. Understand, as you're building your knowledge of how our systems work, the history behind those systems, as you're investigating the history of discrimination in our country, just find ways to make that process fun. So I have a couple of, missed the slide there. So I have a couple of examples that I want to talk through that just kind of highlight the history of systems and then what our systems look like today. In 1954, I think we're all familiar with Brown versus Board of Education. This ruling integrated our schools, or at least prompted the process that we're still going through in integrating our schools. Brown also had unintended consequences, and the effects of them are felt today. It caused the dismissal, demotion, and forced resignation of many experienced, highly credentialed Black educators. After the decision, tens of thousands of Black teachers and principals lost their jobs. So some numbers: 38,000 Black teachers and administrators in 21 southern bordering states lost their jobs. In Alabama, we had 210 Black principals that went down to 57. Virginia, that number declined from 170 to 16, just immediately in that year following Brown versus Board decision. So if we fast forward to today, if we remembered that history of the displacement of Black educators, we can look at recent education reform initiatives that have resulted in the disproportionate displacement of Black educators. Study from the Learning Policy Institute shows that in 2012, or a 2012 study showed that at the height of school closing and layoffs in many cities, the rate of involuntary turnover was much higher for Black teachers than other teachers. Black teachers made up a third of the teachers that were displaced. So again, just going back to my principle, why I think quality, diversity, and equity need to be valued at the same level is, as we are improving quality, we want to make sure that we are not displacing educators of color. So I want to switch gears and talk about another example from our history that focuses more on sexism, because racial discrimination is not the only discrimination in our country. I want you to think about gender discrimination, ageism, the ways that we make people of different religious backgrounds feel discriminated against as well. So looking back, even further back, 100 years ago, the largely women-driven field of midwifery started to be displaced. You may immediately think like, that's simple. We had doctors, we changed the medical field. They were better qualified to deliver babies. But as we examine history, history does not support that assumption. So in the beginning, doctors made giving birth actually less safe because we did not have obstetrics as a field of study, and so generalized doctors started to take over from midwives. We lost the experience of midwives. We lost the experience of midwives who were fifth and sixth generation, passing it down among women and their families. Because of sexism and money, privatizing hospitals, those hospital births became the norm and became more lucrative to have medical interventions during birth instead of the historical knowledge that we had from midwives. So looking at, again, today, grounding ourselves in history can give us more insight into where we are today. Today, women in the US are 3 times more likely to die from a pregnancy-related complication than women in the UK, Japan, or Germany, twice as likely as women in Canada, if we want to be closer to here. 1990 to 2023, many countries listed here, and Singapore, they saw a decline in their maternal mortality, while maternal mortality continues to rise in the US and saw a significant rise during the COVID-19 pandemic. In the US, Black women are 3 times more likely to die from pregnancy-related causes than white women. So we have created a space where we've put women, the historical knowledge that we had about giving birth, we've pushed that out of the medical system, and our medical system is still suffering today because of that. So again, as we're building our historical knowledge, and as you become equity literate, that step 2 is equity fluent. Once you feel you've built up that knowledge, I want you to test yourself, challenge your thinking, engage with people that have the same values, but come at it from a different perspective. Write a script, write a blog, make a vlog, make a TikTok, practice sharing what you think, your perspective, what you've learned. And then talk to people who don't have the same values as you, who have nowhere near the same perspective that you do. Continue to push yourself into tough conversations. I want to imagine that me and Dr. Martin Luther King have something in common, and that really we just want you to speak up. Read first, practice, be informed about what you have to say, but also speak up so that we don't sit by while we see oppression and we see discrimination. And then lastly, on this journey, becoming effective. So when I say become effective, I mean examine your circle of influence. So your circle of influence may be that you can bring you and your coworkers together to become equity literate together. You may want to start a book club in your community, at your job. Maybe you make decisions about orientation and onboarding new staff. You may decide that historical knowledge of systemic discrimination is important information to share during your orientation of new staff. As a researcher, could you ensure that you're engaging and oversampling for groups whose voices historically haven't been centered or considered in research? As a CEO, are you engaging diverse partner organization or compensating diverse stakeholders for their time? Is board representation on your board, does it look like the people you serve as well as looking like the people you need to expand the power of your organization? As you examine your circle of influence, identify those ways that you can advocate for change. And I'm going to double down again on a point I made a little bit earlier from Einstein. Maya Angelou says something very similar. Make every effort to change things you do not like. If you cannot make a change, change your way of thinking. You might find a new solution. And so again, having an open mind is that first step. So with that quote from Queen Mother Maya Angelou, I'm actually going to transition from the academic portion of my talk and really talk about the internal work that we have to do to get where we all want to be, which is a better place for our children. Research and data is not enough. I love research, I love data. I have a master's in engineering. Let's talk about that another time. But this work is about much more than research and numbers. It's about the care, it's about love, it's about the light that you see in a child's eyes when they learn something new. That is what gets me out of bed in the morning, and I believe that we share that. We've been blessed with the opportunity to serve, and the gift is a deeply personal one. And so I want to talk about the deeply personal work that we have to do in order to have that courage to speak up for change. So let's start with ourselves. Are we caring for ourselves? We easily, as caretakers, as people who care for others, who heal others, we very easily put our physical needs to the side. Take it from someone, from me, who has failed at this in the past. I continue to many times today. I can remember working until 1 or 2 a.m. consistently in my 3rd trimester of pregnancy, when I was already a high-risk older mom, still working my tail off. And it didn't make me a better advocate for children. I, in fact, made some of the worst mistakes of my professional career during this time, because I just wasn't caring for myself. According to the National Institute of Health, internationally, teaching is the toughest position on our bodies and our minds. Think about all the crazy, tough jobs out there. Internationally, teaching is recognized as one of the hardest jobs in the world. So who does it really help for you to work in environments where you don't feel you can bring your fully charged self? Having the presence of mind to speak up for change really requires that we invest inward, care for ourselves in order to show up as our true selves. And that's what's needed for courage. Thinking again about what Maslow was trying to tell us, in paraphrasing from Psychology Today, self-actualization is a process, a journey dedicated to embracing who we really are. You all are experts in the health and well-being of children. You've studied, you use your expertise to facilitate spaces of learning and caring for others. You start children on their journey to self-actualization. You start them on the journey to learning and changing and growing. But we cannot be effective champions for them if we don't care for ourselves, if we don't turn that caring inward. The courage to stand up for children starts with healing yourself, not hurting yourself. And so I know that this is doable. We can start small, drink more water, find ways to improve your health in your home. Sometimes I light a candle and it changes everything for me. Foster friendship. Sometimes we work so much, we leave our friendships to the wayside. We leave those things that feed us. And then find ways to just be loving to yourself in small ways every day. None of us can pour from an empty cup. So what comes next after we feel strong within ourselves, after we feel cared for and loved within ourselves, is finding the courage to stand up for what we know is right. When I was writing this speech, I kept thinking about Muhammad Ali and this story about him. We all know him as a former heavyweight champion, the GOAT of boxing, the greatest ever. But in his later life, he suffered from Parkinson's disease. In 1997, he agreed to lend his name to the Hospital Center in Phoenix, Arizona, a center dedicated to providing innovative, specialized care to patients with Parkinson's. Now, at the dedication ceremony, as they were opening this center, his wife goes to the doctor who's running the center and says, "Muhammad wants you to take everyone, care for everyone, regardless of their ability to pay." Ali was a man of faith and moral convictions, and he believed that a person should not be denied medical care simply because they couldn't afford it. Now, I don't know how many of us would turn down Muhammad Ali, but the doctor he was talking to was like, that is not possible. So impossible that he didn't think it was worth even speaking to the hospital board about. No, thank you, let's not do that. But this is what Muhammad Ali said. Impossible is not a fact, it's an opinion. Impossible is not a declaration, it's a dare. Impossible is potential, it's temporary, it's nothing. And with those words, that doctor went ahead and went to that hospital board and said this is a Catholic hospital. We're founded on the principle of caring for people regardless of their ability to pay. And because of Muhammad Ali and that doctor, thousands of people have been treated for Parkinson's disease. Parents, single parents who would have had to give up their children were able to continue to keep their children in their homes because they got world-class level care for their Parkinson's. These things change communities. and he stood by his principles and he dared someone else to do the same. The takeaway from all of this is to know your principles. It's why I'm not here to say this is how you should think, but this is how we can learn together to create our own principles. And then you speak authentically from those principles. You believe that nothing is possible. I mean, my favorite part about Muhammad Ali is to remember that impossible is a dare, and it's an opinion. So, So lastly, now that we've found the courage to stand up for what we believe in, we have to be willing to use our voices more often and more courageously in our day-to-day lives. And to even if we have fear of failure, to speak through that fear. It's like any muscle, using your voice requires practice and exercise. And trust me, I know it's hard these days. Everyone is afraid of making a mistake, but I'm here to tell you it's okay and advisable to keep learning, to have some stick-to-itiveness. That was my father's word for resilience. Any of you have parents who had their own words? And you find yourself using those words even though you rolled your eyes when you were a kid. I love that stick-to-itiveness. And I can tell you about a mistake that I made that makes me so embarrassed. I literally have never told anyone this. I'm just going to tell a room full of people. So I was applying for this fellowship to increase the number of diverse leaders in the field. And this was 15 years ago, so don't hold it against me too badly today. So a white classmate of mine asked me if I thought white women were welcome to apply. The actual answer was yes, of course it was yes. But I asked my boss, who was a white woman, she says, white girls come a dime a dozen. And then I went and repeated it to my classmate, word for word. I was that person. Knew that someone said something to me that was problematic, but was like, oh, it's okay. Someone said it to me, I can pass it on. I was talking about race with absolutely no thoughtfulness. I am embarrassed. And you don't have to run me off the stage. I'm embarrassed enough about it. But there are 3 reasons why I tell this story. First of all, no matter how wrong you have been in the past, and in spite of every mistake that you will make, speak up anyway. Find your courage and find your voice. I also share because I don't want you to make the mistake I made. I was speaking about race, again, with no care and no caution. Open your eyes to the feelings of others. You want to speak up, but you do want to exercise care. Don't use this excuse I made. Oh, my white friend said it to me, I can say it to white people. My black friend said it to me, I can say it to black people. Don't do that. Have your voice, proceed with caution. And if you've made mistakes, warn others. I am warning you. Warn others. Think of a mistake that you've made and make sure that you share with somebody. When we're talking about race, gender, age, culture, if you've invalidated someone's feelings or challenged their beliefs, take it as a lesson. Be vulnerable enough to share when you've made mistakes. Be vulnerable enough to share your lessons learned so that we don't go on repeating these things. So I want to know, if you don't listen to anything else I say, if you can commit to just having a tough conversation, sometime before you leave this conference, ask a question that you would have been embarrassed to ask. If you can commit to sharing a mistake that you've made with someone, if you can commit to actually approaching someone and saying, you know, you said this and it hurt my feelings. If you can do that, I would deeply appreciate that as a first step to being open to pushing for change. Anybody? I can put my hand up. I've already shared mine. But anybody else can commit to having a tough conversation the next couple of days? I love it. That's not 0. So now that we've taken care of ourselves, we're in touch with our courage, even though we're scared, we're going to speak up anyway. Lastly, we need to find our community. And finding your community is not finding your echo chamber. Again, it's not finding your echo chamber. You have to know that you must engage with people who do not think the same as you. Again, find other champions for children. Build a community of people committed to children, but find people who think differently from you. And then speak up, especially in the places where you have been told your voice doesn't matter. Speak up in the places where you've been told your voice doesn't belong. The very definition of diversity is that we speak in those places where people told us it's not the place for us. And before I get to my Q&A, I have a family story. It's my own family Black history story that I wanted to share that really inspires me. And it's the story of my great-uncle, Uncle John, who was a major in the United States Army. In the late 30s and 40s, he served his country. And now, as the story goes, he suffered the fate of many Black servicemen when he was accidentally shot by friendly fire. We can't know for sure whether or not it was truly an accident, but he spilled blood for his country. When he returned back to the United States, he was lucky enough to get the GI Bill. And he didn't actually use the GI Bill for his own education. He supported my beloved grandmother, his sister, to get her bachelor's and her master's degree in library science at a historically Black school. He asked her to put off marriage and children until she was educated. This is a Black woman in the 40s he did this for. And I'm telling you this story, again, for 3 reasons. When it comes to what we do, we are the ones on the front lines of centuries of pain and trauma. And to be effective, we have to do what my Uncle John did and pull something beautiful from that pain. Look into the pain of the children that we're serving and find ways to help them see something beautiful in their lives no matter what. The second reason I share this story is because he had courage, like Muhammad Ali, to challenge the existing ways things were done. He believed that a Black woman should have every educational opportunity, and then he put his money where his mouth was, money that he didn't use for himself. And finally, he made a sacrifice. He didn't keep everything for himself. He raised his community up, even though it cost him. Some of us, we won't even leave our comfort zones. We won't make the sacrifice of leaving our comfort zones, of leaving our security. Advocating for racial equity or for equal pay or fighting gender discrimination or ageism may cost you something. But think about the folks that came before you, like my Uncle John, and think about how much it's worth. It's worth it to change your community for the better. Uncle John is not here to see the benefit of his sacrifice in my generation and the next generation. When my grandmother was taking care of her husband who was disabled, she was still able to work because she had those degrees that her brother paid for. So again, before you leave this conference, I want you to have a little courage to use your voice without being afraid. Have one hard conversation. Ask a difficult question. Because if you want to start that internal journey of changing yourself, that's going to lead to the systems that we want to change for our children. Thank you. So I'm looking for Megan for how we handle Q&A.
At this time, we're going to invite folks to come on down for Q&A. You can line up at the microphones. We have 2 of them. You don't have to put your mouth like right on it, but you got to get a little close. Because we do have audio recording for this session, please do use the microphone. Don't just try to shout. So we're going to give a couple minutes for folks to come on down and line up. And if nobody else does it, I already have a question. But I'm going to get you a bottle of water too to take a little moment while folks come on down.
Thank you. Read my mind.
I already had to stand up because daycare called in, so I thought I'd rather be brave. I teach in the College of Education at Winthrop University, and we are kind of at an all-time national enrollment low in getting educators to be educators and seeing this trend of teachers leaving. And so my question is, how do you perceive teaching that courage and compassion in the education setting for like college students becoming teachers?
Absolutely. I want to think about that for a second. So I will say this just first and foremost, that we have to advocate for pay for educators. That if you want to, step one, a step one thing to put on your list, look back at the history of how we've paid teachers over time, of how this was an education, this was a field that was more respected and better paid when it was more male-driven. And now that it has become a more female-driven field, the pay continues to be depressed. So I want us to all just, put that at the top of your list. Learn the history of how we viewed educators in this country, how we've paid educators in this country till today. So I want to ensure that we give that courage and inspiration, but courage, you cannot eat courage and you cannot eat inspiration. That is Maslow's hierarchy of need. But the other part of this, and again, I'm all about the internal work. I think sharing, we talk about Maslow's hierarchy of need as something you do for someone else, but also ensuring that our educators are steeped in the fact that that hierarchy has to come for themselves first. They have to make sure that they are meeting their own needs, so they're not trying to give out of an empty cup, because that's why folks are leaving, because they are done. They are empty. Again, internationally, the toughest job across the world. Any other questions?
I am on several boards, and one of them does some programming with a parent cafe. And one of the things we try to do is teach our parents how to advocate for their children. And so when I think about some of the development, whether it be inclusion, where teachers and things are concerned, would you have any advice on how to approach that from a parent standpoint, that if they feel like their child, like you said, that teacher needs rest, that teacher needs education on how to deal with just cultural issues, how to help a parent stand in that place for their student?
Yes. So I'm going to talk about a program from my previous work, the National Black Child Development Institute. We had the Family Empowerment Program. That program was a parenting class given, but it was also about teaching parents that they are a leader within their homes and that they should come with a vision for their child's education. So I want to talk about the proactive part, and then when parents are experiencing and how they respond. The proactive part of that, we would encourage parents to write a letter to their child's teacher day one. Start with being that leader. This is my child. This is how they learn the best. This is what supports them. So you kind of start off by saying, I'm your partner. I'm the leader in my child's education, and you're coming along with me as my co-lead. And so you start off by creating that partner experience long before you hit any of the bumps that are coming. Then we can work together. Now, if you haven't established that partnership and the bumps come, I really encourage parents to get data so that they're talking about not just their child's experience, but are other parents experiencing this as well, but again, approach it as a partnership. What can we as parents do to engage with our partner educators and our partner nurturers for our children to work with them to change? I have engaged with parents who said, I can never work with that teacher. I could never see them as a partner. They're this, they're that, and the third. Or the teacher who's saying, no, that parent, they don't value education. That's why their child acts like that. But when they come to the table and they get together, and maybe even asking a center director to be a mediator in that conversation, identify some common goals. And then one thing I've told parents very practically, when folks say, my goals for your child's development is all about deficits-based, what are the positive goals for my child's development? What do you want them to learn? Yes, we have to correct negative behaviors, but we also need to have a balance of the positive things that we see in our children. And so having that challenge. And I get how difficult that can be, though, because you still have to leave your child around people that you may not feel they feel welcome around. And so also considering alternatives. I know it's tough to say, but as a parent, I can't sit by and say that it would be okay with me, and if I felt my child didn't feel welcome, if I didn't see the changes that I was looking for, that I would leave my child in a situation. And I know that every parent doesn't have that luxury. That is a luxury to have the money and the resources to be able to travel somewhere else with their child. But I think that's a tough conversation that has to be had. But start with partnership, try partnership, push for partnership, bring in a third party to mediate conversations. And if you're not seeing that change, then there just may be a different direction to go.
Can you talk more about your camp program?
Yes.
Because as a mental health coordinator, it's difficult to find services for children who are having issues with social emotional regulation. And that's also a reason that teachers are kind of burned out.
Absolutely. So it's not my program. Let me say, I was telling the story of Cindra Taylor, who is an educator in Atlanta. She opened 3 of her own centers in Atlanta, and then she provides technical assistance to others. So Cindra, she is a special case, right? She was is an institution in the city of Atlanta. And so knowing the resources in the community was something she was an expert at. She helped other centers identify and engage with those resources. You're already a mental health provider. And so are you asking me about how to find those resources in the community for other educators? So I would say actually reaching out to research institutions, to your university partners would be one place to start. To see they sometimes just have their ear to the ground in the community in different ways and in different disciplines. So working across disciplines, also engaging with health systems. Our doctors also are the doctors of our minds, and so ensuring that those partnerships are set up, especially because everybody here is not in an urban area where there are a bunch of different community partners to reach out to. But there's usually a hospital nearby that may have a hospital mental health staff that can help to identify resources, and even being open to virtual resources, being open to people who are not locally located. That's something that has helped. But that absolutely is a crisis, that we have discipline practices that don't respond to mental health challenges. So then if when you were 3, you were presenting mental health challenges and you didn't get supports, think about what's happened between 3 and 5. And think about the fact that if you are a 3-year-old and your behavior is so challenging that you are disrupting learning, that your home is in crisis. You are coming from a household that is in crisis, and we've left that whole household in crisis for many years. Where are they at 7 or 8? And so the earlier, the better, to ensure that the long-term trajectory of that family and that child is positively impacted.
So I've been thinking a lot about a situation in our community recently, and it's one of those where I hate conflict, but I'm also trying to figure out how much to engage. It's a situation where a person from an organization went in front of our school board and spoke out against teaching social emotional learning in the classroom. And this organization has also spoken out against teaching race and teaching critical race theory, which they don't do in high school and elementary school anyway. But so I donate to the organization, to an organization that just hired her and their staff. And so it was very easy for me to email some people and say, I am really not comfortable with this. I'm not sure I'm comfortable with my donation being used for her staff. But I guess that the other thing I'm really thinking about is, do I talk to this person? And if I did that, like, how would you go about that? How would it's not somebody I know. It's someone who makes my heart rate rise and my blood pressure rise as I think about it. And so how would I calmly engage her and not put her on the defensive? Easy.
So I have 2 things. When I talk about kind of learning your history, I would even encourage us to learn the history of people who spoke up. So for me, when I'm thinking about history, that's why I talk about Muhammad Ali and talk about people who spoke up in spite of. So I would say definitely, writing a script, that is my thing, knowing what you're gonna say, but also engaging with people who have taken on tough conversations. And like you said, not put people on the defensive. How do you do that? For me, my thing is, but again, I really wanted to encourage you to find people who inspire you, that have done this type of work, that have done it throughout history and currently, to get those nuggets. I always say I'm not smart. I just kind of like find good thinkers and model myself after them. But the way that I would approach it is to start with a shared goal. We both want X, Y, or Z. Can you agree that we want our children, Maslow's hierarchy of need, our children learn best when they feel good about themselves? That children who don't feel great about themselves. And so that shared goal of, we want our children to feel good about themselves, because that's a core undercurrent of the argument you're speaking to, is about children not feeling good about themselves. We can have tough conversations and facilitate ways for children to feel good about themselves. And social emotional learning, children knowing how to have conversations with each other, children knowing how to disagree without going into bullying, children understanding how to express their emotions when they are uncomfortable. These are the types of things. We cannot erase uncomfortable conversations from schools, but we can give children tools. That's a shared goal. Even if we never talk about race in school again, there are still going to be tough moments, challenging times that children have in school. They need to have social and emotional skills. And they certainly will learn them at home, but school is where the rubber meets the road. It's where they need to learn.
So I really appreciate, we're very close together right now, aren't we? I really appreciate the openness of your remarks. So we all wear multiple hats in this room in our professional lives, our personal lives. And so in addition to being a researcher, I am the mother of 2 brown boys who, my husband's experience with racism and xenophobia and, responses to his last name is something that I will never understand in the same way that he does. And the experience that my children have navigating any isms that come their way is very different from what I, as a well-educated white woman, experience. And so one of the things that I struggle with as a mother and in my professional life is sort of, how do I use my privilege for good, not evil? And how do I read the signs when it's not my lane to get involved, right? I would never want my children to think that I didn't have their back to speak out or speak up, but also because my experience of, mistreatment and sexism is very different than what they'll experience. And so, in a broader way, there are not always clear road signs for when your voice is helpful or not. Is it just putting myself out there and just accepting when I'm told that my voice is not what's needed? Is it holding back to wait for the right moment or an invitation? Obviously, every situation is different, but I'm feeling tense about it.
I get it. I get it. So when I said speaking up in the places where you're told that your voice isn't welcome is the definition of diversity, I know that that's a little bit controversial, because there are places where people are told not to speak up. But I would say your voice doesn't always have to be at the, thanks for the water. Your voice doesn't always have to be at the forefront for you to speak up. So it may be that you speak up with your funding. It may be that you speak up with having tough conversations in the background. I think sometimes when we think speak up, it's got to be at the podium, it's got to be out in front. But you can speak up by volunteering your time. You can speak up by donating. You can speak up by pulling someone to the side and saying, I have this question. I'd like to challenge our thinking in this way or that way. But your voice is always needed. I don't agree with this idea that certain people should sit down and not be present. Our voices are all needed. Now, what your voice, again, how you bring that voice into fruition can be different. If it's welcome in different ways, be open to that. But I think that if you are being called, again, it's hard work. If you are being called to speak up, do it. And as our last person that asked the question was saying, I'm a person who donates. So that's using your privilege. I mean, that right there is a perfect example of like, I'm using my privilege to ensure that I open up a conversation that might lead to challenging a way of thinking. Just as I was saying that, it reminded me, I'm not going to think of this man's name, but I'm sure if you just Google his story, you will find it. A man who has convinced multiple grand dragons of the KKK to step down. I've watched his interviews over and over because think about how scared he was the first time he had a conversation. But also the conversations that he had were over the course of years. It wasn't one conversation. So I also don't want you to put a whole lot of pressure on this one conversation that you're going to have. It's almost establishing a relationship and a rapport that gives you the opportunity to have conversations over time that I think is most important when you approach a first conversation. But definitely, I mean, now that I've mentioned him, I'm gonna go watch his interviews again. Because if ever I'm like, you know what, I don't have the courage to say this to this person, I'm like, you know what, this man, he was fine. Like, I'm certain he was scared, but he did his thing, and that is real change. Other questions? Should I make sure I'm not in the way of us getting to eat?
So, I mean, thank you for such inspirational words and presentation. And this is probably a lazy question, but it's back to the equity literate portion of your talk and the, you know, those data related to Brown versus the board and the displacement, something that just, oh my gosh, why didn't I know that?
I didn't know it till I started reading.
Okay, so where? That was my question about, you know, suggestions. I know that there's got to be so many reading lists and recommendations. I'm interested in what you would suggest.
So if I'm thinking about a topic, I start with scholarship. I start with the people who are doing the research. I start with the people who are practicing, like who is doing this work. So I quoted from the Learning Policy Institute. I quoted from the National African American Smithsonian. We as taxpayers have given large amounts of our money to the Smithsonian institutions, to universities. And so just like the roads that we drive on, we should consider the knowledge that's out there our own. We should consider it a part of what we have access to. And so I didn't know those numbers around midwives. That was a special that the National Museum of African American History did a few years ago during Black History Month. So I would say ensuring museums are a great place, again, because we fund those museums. They're ours to ensure that we engage in historical conversations based on those. And then researchers, universities, and people doing the work. Like, how many folks do you know that are engaging in practice, that have gone to school in a particular subject, and you're like, what did you learn that I don't know? Yeah.
We had an opportunity yesterday to be present for a BIPOC Alana table around prenatal to 3 work. And one of the folks there was from the Catawba Nation, and one of the things she said during her introduction was, "Thank you so much for having us here. We've never been asked what we think on these topics." And then in a later meeting that same day, we were hearing from somebody at Queens Public Library who said, "Thank you so much for asking us these questions. Nobody ever has." So it seems like your framework on the becoming literate sort of implicitly talks about asking those questions. Yeah. But could you speak a little bit more to how to be an ally with that literacy and lifting up those, like, tools, tricks, how to go about that?
Yeah, that gets to my first principle, which is that, like, I am not a speaker or finder of solutions. I engage with people who I know are the experts, who engage directly with children or engage directly with diverse children. And so one of the things I think about that we don't do often enough when we're looking for funding for a new program is to say, how much will it cost to ensure that I can engage diverse folks, right? The conversations that you had, convening those people traveling to get there, that was not free. And so I think that the program standards, the funding standards that we have, we need to challenge. A lot of times you don't want to go to a funder to say, listen, $100,000 does not cut it. It's $200,000 because that other $100,000 is about how we engage diverse communities. That's going to be tough because you may need to sub-grant to an organization that actually engages that community, because walking in, knocking on the door and saying, will you talk to me doesn't work. You need experts who engage with diverse communities. So for me, I do take it back to money in that because it drives the way that we do our work. And so we need to think about how we ask for dollars in a different way to ensure that we have the funding. I'm not going to do it in our free time, to make sure that we have the funding. And when you're engaging diverse communities, to ensure that some of that funding is for them. How do we ensure that when we bring stakeholders to the table, we are paying them for their time? Just like you're getting paid to engage with them, they should get paid to engage with you. Other questions? Last call? Well, this has certainly been a privilege, and thank you again. I look forward to kind of talking some more throughout the day. We have such amazing panels, so I don't want to be in between us and getting to those panels.